Pam, you just want me to start, or do you want to say?
Yep, go right ahead.
Okay, we're just about there, I think. Okay, good evening, folks. Welcome to tonight's presentation by the Border Historical Society, a very special presentation by one of the most eminent American historians living today, Alan Taylor at the University of Virginia. And I want to express a special thanks to him for agreeing to talk to us, which was extremely generous. And I want to thank our member Pam Beveridge for being so bold as to ask Alan and actually landing the big fish, as it were. So, just terrific. I can't tell you how pleased I am at tonight's topic. And for those of you who don't know us, we're the Border Historical Society located in Eastport, Maine. We are a cross-border historical society. We'd love to have topics that span the U.S.-Canadian border, and luckily for us, Professor Taylor has written repeatedly about cross-border issues. I think we're going to have a lot of interesting things for both our Canadian and American folks watching tonight. The Border Society does ask that you your microphone, if possible, for you. If you have a question, how we usually proceed.
Okay, here it is. I don't know what they're talking about. So
is that we ask you to mute, and if you have questions, if you could insert that in the chat function, that would be great. Okay, so let's see. Pam, if you could mute everybody in the same place where you shared the hosting function.
Yep.
Okay. And at the end of the presentation, you'll be able to ask questions and please put them in the chat function. So the Border Historical Society, very active. We would love to have more members though. And for 10 Yankee dollars, you too can be a member of the prestigious Border Historical Society, and we'd love to have you on board. Our latest project is restoring a barracks building that dates to just after the War of 1812 here in Eastport, Maine. And exciting news, Stephen and Tabitha King are footing the bill for the current stage of reconstruction of that structure. And boy, are we happy about that. This brings us to our speaker tonight, Professor Alan Taylor of the University of Virginia, who's very kind to speak to us tonight. And I think the headline here is Local Boy Makes Good. Alan is a Maine native, a graduate of Colby College, and received his PhD in American history from Brandeis University, just outside of Boston. He had a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of Early American History and Culture in Williamsburg, Virginia. And since that time, he's taught at Boston University, the University of California at Davis, and now at the University of Virginia, where he holds the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair since 2014. He also has held a variety of honors from 2016 to 2017. He served as the Harmsworth Professor at Queen's College, Oxford University in England. And of course, Alan has published like mad. Alan writes books faster than I can read them. It's a very impressive list, starting with his book centered in Maine entitled Liberty Men and Great Proprietors, The Revolutionary Settlement on the Maine Frontier, 1760 to 1820, which came out in 1990. And most recently, American Republics, A Continental History of the United States, 1783 to 1850. These books have received very wide notice. Notably, his second book, William Cooperstown, won the Bancroft, Beveridge, and Pulitzer Prizes. That's a trifecta, we call it down here in New York. And The Internal Enemy won the Pulitzer Prize for American History and the Merle-Curti Prize for Social History, presented by the Organization of American Historians. American Colonies won the 2001 gold medal for nonfiction from the Commonwealth Club of California. The Divided Ground won the 2007 Society for Historians of the Early Republic, or SHEAR, book prize. And the Society of the Cincinnati has also awarded him a book prize for the Civil War of 1812. And the Empire State Prize History, which is a New York prize, also for the Civil War of 1812. He's won numerous teaching prizes. I'm sorry, I can't go on. He has a very impressive resume, but I've sort of had to shamelessly cut that down. Many achievements. And I'll finish off with that. In 2016, he won membership in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and more recently in 2020, received membership in the American Philosophical Society. And on that note, I hope you will all join me in welcoming Alan Taylor. And Professor Taylor, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Josh, for that very kind introduction. And I want to thank you and Pam for helping to arrange this. And I'm grateful for the work that all the members of the Border Historical Society are doing to save the fort and to promote history education in that corner of the world. Here's an image I'm showing here of Passamaquoddy Bay and Eastport. This is from the late 1830s. I want you to enjoy it because there's going to be very limited content about Eastport in particular. It would be carrying codfish to Eastport for me to speak much about it, but you should be having Josh talk about it since he's become the great expert on that corner of the world. I'm going to talk more about the bigger picture, the continental wide picture. So trying to put Eastport and the border of Maine with New Brunswick in a larger context of the overall border with Canada and the United States, but also just to think about other borders, because I see them as all interacting in ways that shape one another. So here's an image of Halifax. And one of the reasons why the Eastport is a very vulnerable place in American hands during the War of 1812 is British naval might. And Halifax, which is represented here, image around the time of the American Revolution, was the principal naval station for the British fleet in North American waters. And so certainly there were privateers, American privateers and American warships that operated sometimes quite successfully in these waters, but overall it's a British naval predominance that gives them the strategic advantage there. So it meant that the War of 1812 in terms of American initiative is largely fought elsewhere. And the United States just doesn't invest significant resources to fight anywhere along the Bay of Fundy because they just know that they're not in a position to compete with the Royal Navy there. Now, the War of 1812, most Americans don't think much about. If you know, the books about the War of 1812 have titles or subtitles like Forgotten Conflict or A Neglected War or Not as Boring as You Might Think. Because Americans' books they go right past whatever War of 1812 book there might be. This is until Josh's book comes out. But right now it's they're between the American Revolution books and the Civil War books, and that's not going to work well for a book about the War of 1812. I tried to fool people by entitling a book The Civil War of 1812, but this may have just led to some more returns. But I want to make the case today that the War of 1812's quite a bit different from how most people think about it, and a lot more important. But when Americans do think about the War of 1812, it's for a few scattered episodes, like the victories of the US frigate, the Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, as represented here in this painting in a battle against a British frigate, the Guerriere, in 1812. So there's some memory of that. It's helped by the fact that the USS Constitution still exists. Or there's a memory that is revived every time the British Prime Minister visits Washington, D.C. There is some humor about the burning of the White House and the Capitol building. It's represented here in this particular image, with the White House on the left and the Capitol building shown on the right, in a much closer proximity than is in fact the case in Washington. Or there's a happier memory for Americans anyway, of the victory at Baltimore that came a month after the British captured Washington, D.C. And that involves at Baltimore. Could I just ask, if you have your microphone on, if you could silence it at this point? Thank you. Or there's a memory of the great battle at New Orleans in January of 1815, where Andrew Jackson succeeded in overwhelming a British force that was attacking there. So what these all have in common is they're episodes that show the United States on the defensive. Shows the British as the aggressors, and cast the war as Americans against the British, as if it were that neat. What it leaves out, in fact, is most of the war, which was fought in Canada. And here's a map just to situate you of what the situation looked like shortly before the War of 1812. You can see the United States, the states of the United States were entirely east of the Mississippi. Had acquired territory to the west of the Mississippi, known as Louisiana, which extended as far west as the Rocky Mountains. But the United States at that time did have possessions on the west coast, with the exception of one fur trading post at Astoria. It is not an official government position. British North America is pretty robust in terms of the territory claimed, and it's a collection of different colonies that are not united in any way except through the British Crown. So you do have Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and then you've got the two Canadas. You've got Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Now, when Americans usually look at this map, they say, well, there's some mistake because Upper Canada is below Lower Canada. But this is because our perspective is a very terrestrial one. Now, I suspect people familiar, excuse me, with Eastport are familiar with the concept of going down east, the notion that you're going downwind. Well, to get to Upper Canada, you're going upstream. So that's why it was called Upper Canada. Things moved by water. And that's why the Great Lakes are going to be a major theater of this war. The war for the United States is primarily fought around the Great Lakes. And the American version of the War of 1812, which I've been giving you, if there are Canadians listening, they've been very polite because they haven't butted in and said, well, what about the Battle of Queenston Heights or all the other battles that in fact were fought in Canada, and most of which were American defeats, such as the Battle of Queenston, which happened in the fall of 1812, very near Niagara Falls, just downstream from it. And it was a problem that the United States had, that they were trying to create a military almost overnight. They were sending raw recruits into combat without virtually any training. And it went very badly because they are going up against British regulars who are well-trained and supplemented by Native American warriors and by Canadian militia. And so the American invasion of Canada, which is tried repeatedly, doesn't get any sustained traction because of these defeats. And an observation was made just before we started this program by somebody that Josh, in writing about the War of 1812, was writing about an American war that they lost, which suggests that we do have Canadians on here. And in my experience, Canadians are remarkably polite, patient people, except for one issue, which is the War of 1812. And they just really want Americans to admit that we lost. And if you do, the Canadian will do anything for you. They'll wash your car, they'll mow your lawn. They just want that to be recognized. And I'm willing to do that. But I'm also going to argue now that the War of 1812 is a subset of a much bigger war, which I'll call the War of the 1810s. And in that much bigger war, which I'm going to argue began before 1812 and lasted well after it, into 1819. In that bigger war, the United States won. So Canadians get full credit for winning their part of the war, but their part of the war is it's a very important part, but still a part of a war that is continental wide. And that's what I want to talk about primarily today. Now, the War of 1812 involves Native people. So it's not simply Americans against the British, but involves many Native nations. We think that this is a representation of Tecumseh, who was Shawnee, lived on the American side of the border, and essentially in what is now Indiana, but was busily trying to create a pan-Indian confederation that included Native peoples in Canada, but throughout much of the United States, including down in Alabama, Tennessee. And this was one of the things that inspired Americans to embark on this war, was they were very upset about this attempt to organize Indian resistance to American expansion, and the fact that Tecumseh was encouraged in this by the British, and they're encouraged by this because the British thought of this as bolstering their defense of Canada against what they saw as potential American aggression. But from an American's perspective, this is a justification for war, because this seems to be a provocation, because the British are forming alliances with Native peoples who happen to be within the boundaries of the United States. Now, these Native peoples didn't think of themselves as American citizens or American subjects. They thought of themselves as independent people who belonged to their own nations, and they felt they were entirely within their own rights to negotiate with whoever they wanted to. But that's not how Americans saw it. And this is how Americans saw it. Here we have an image. It's a cartoon. It's a very propagandistic cartoon. It's produced to justify the American war effort. It shows the myth that the British were buying scalps from Indian peoples. So the man in the blue coat, who is on the bottom, is an American soldier, and he's being scalped by Indians, and then they are turning to this very portly British officer and receiving money in exchange. I just want to remind you, this did not, in fact, happen. And during the War of 1812 or any time in the run-up to the War of 1812. But it's something that Americans believe did happen. And it helped to motivate them to go into the, along with certain maritime issues that were also significant. But the United States is engaged in conflict with Native peoples, and they perceive other empires in North America, not just the British, but also the Spanish, who were occupying Florida at the time. They saw them as offering haven to Native peoples and also haven for escaped enslaved people. And this was particularly the case in Florida. So I want to argue today that there are a set of conflicts that we tend to think of as distinct, as separate. They include the American occupation of West Florida in 1810, effort to use covert forces to seize East Florida in 1812, something in 13, something known as the Patriot War. the attack on Tecumseh's and Tenskwatawa's village in Indiana at Tippecanoe in 1811, along with the War of 1812. And then events after the War of 1812, the attack on the so-called Negro Fort in 1816 in Florida, attacks on the Seminoles in 1818. They're all a package. And what holds them together is an American belief that their security is compromised as long as there is another empire near the United States, one that is capable of entering into alliances with Native peoples and capable of offering haven for enslaved people. And so in the story, Florida plays a very large role. So you probably thought you weren't going to hear much about Florida to talk about the Canadian-American borderland. But in order to put that borderland in perspective, you have to spend some time on Florida. And one of the prime reasons is this guy, Andrew Jackson. And for the time being, he's still on a $20 bill. Andrew Jackson is the great military genius of the Americans in this time, certainly very accomplished in war, but obviously a very controversial character as well. And in the run-up to the war, what was very important to him and other Southern men, white men, is to defend their way of life. And their way of life includes slavery. And for Andrew Jackson, who is a slaveholder on quite a large scale, he has a great hostility toward Native peoples and a great determination to, if he can, use this war, meaning the War of 1812, as an opportunity to seize Florida. Now, Florida is not part of the British Empire. It's part of the Spanish Empire. But Spain was allied with Britain in a war in Europe at the time against Napoleon. So they weren't in a position to say no to the British so much. Now, the Spanish they've not declared war on the United States. The United States has not declared war on Spain. But the perspective of somebody like Andrew Jackson and other leading Southern officials is that Spain is a weak pawn of the British, particularly in Florida. And so at the start of the war, Jackson wrote to the American governor of Louisiana and said, quote, "I hope the government will permit us to traverse the southern coast and aid in planting American eagles on the ramparts of Mobile, Pensacola, and St. Augustine." All of those were, this parenthetical comment, all of those were Spanish possessions at that time. "British influence must be destroyed, or we will have the whole southern tribe of Indians to fight and slave insurrections to quell in all the southern states." So the belief was that Florida is a place that could promote slave insurrections and assist Native peoples in attacking American frontier settlements in places like Georgia and Tennessee. And so for Andrew Jackson, the War of 1812 is to be fought in Florida as well as in Canada. Now, Jackson's big opportunity comes when the Creek Indians of what is now Alabama rose in rebellion, not all the Creeks, but a big chunk of them. And Jackson leads forces from Tennessee and destroys their chief settlement, a place the Americans called Horseshoe Bend. And it's a mass slaughter, men, women, and children. It's the bloodiest battle of the larger War of 1812 is fought in Alabama, and it ends up being a very one-sided one. And in the wake of this battle, what Jackson does is he negotiates a peace treaty with the Creeks, and he extorts about 21 million acres of land from them. Most of the land was actually taken from Creeks who had supported the United States in the war. But they just happened to be in locations that Jackson and other American leaders very much wanted to have. And then after that victory, it's after that Jackson will first go and seize Spanish Pensacola, even though, again, Spain was not part of the war. He did this, he thought, to bolster American security. And then he went over and to New Orleans, defended against the British attack culminated in the Battle of January 1815. Now, a lot of people will tell you that this was a battle that was just a communication mistake because the war had ended, and that's not true. Yes, there had been a peace treaty that had been provisionally agreed to by diplomats at Ghent in Europe in December of 1814, Christmas Day. And so this battle was held a couple of weeks after that. Nobody knows peace treaty. And the other thing about peace treaties is they're not binding until they're ratified. And the United States had not ratified the Treaty of Ghent in January of 1815. And they're still fighting, not just in New Orleans, but on the high seas and elsewhere in January and even early February. So the war's not over when Jackson fights this battle. And so this battle is not, something just quaint or something about Jackson's future presidential political profile, which it, of course, in part it is. It's much more significant than that. I'm going to argue it's the most important battle of the War of 1812 for reasons that I'll get into shortly. Now, the Treaty of Ghent, I mentioned, happens in December of 1814. It took many months to negotiate this. And during those months, there's a lot of ebb and flow in the war. When it starts, the British are in a pretty strong position. They've occupied eastern Maine, including Eastport. They hold northern Michigan. They will seize the Sea Islands of Georgia. And it looks, and in August, they managed to, in a hit and run raid, get into Washington, D.C. and do a lot of destruction. Very embarrassing. The American government was, to be blunt, bankrupt financially and really didn't have prospects that it was going to be able to sustain the war much longer. British negotiators themselves weren't keen for the war to go on. They never wanted the war in the first place. They did want to punish the United States, though. And the chief way that they were hoping that they would get to keep Eastport and other islands in Passamaquoddy Bay and maybe have some other border adjustment in northern Maine. But the chief thing that they were really pushing for negotiations was to create an Indian buffer zone in much of the American Northwest. The Northwest at that time meant Michigan, Wisconsin, that area. But they found that the American negotiators, no matter how bleak their situation was militarily, would not budge on that. And